5 days you work, 1 whole day to play. Come on everybody, wear your roller skates today. It's Saturday, 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 it's Saturday, Saturday, it's Saturday, Saturday, it's Saturday,
Saturday with Renee.
Yes, welcome everybody back to Black Liberation Media. Saturdays with Renee, episode 116, featuring Renee Johnston. I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your co-host. Please like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon. We are not live, but how you doing this week, Renee?
You know how sometimes you get sick and then you feel better, but it like transfers to this cough that just, I don't know, it just never ends. So
We're in that lingering after effects.
Yes, we're in that phase. So I've discovered that if I talk too much, if the temperature changes too drastically, like if I go from inside to outside or outside to inside, if I climb the stairs too fast, it's brutal, man. I don't know, like between getting old and the weather craziness and living here in this crazy place where like up is down and right is left. Some wild stuff happening, man. It's wild.
Yeah, and if folks are not familiar, you are in the East Coast of the United States. I'm in the Mid-Atlantic, where we have similar temperature shifts.
Right.
And we've been going from 20 degrees to 50 degrees to 40 degrees.
Right. In like a 12-hour span.
Yeah. So
like wake up and it's 20-something degrees outside, and by midday it's 50-something. It don't make no sense.
And then it dips back down, but then it'll be 50 with the wind making it feel like it's 30. So it's all over the place, and I get it. The temperature sensitivity is serious as we get older.
Yes.
So, but as is always the case, you know, as my kids say, we thug it out. And as you pointed out the other day, we haven't missed the Saturdays yet.
Which is still crazy.
That is kind of crazy. So, I mean, everybody out here talking about LeBron streaks, double-digit scoring streaks, longevity in the game. They got nothing. He got nothing on what we have cooking over here on Saturdays with Renee.
Oh, so, man.
Too
much. So we are pre-recording.
Yeah.
So, but it's still today. It's still Saturday. Yeah. We're just earlier. But I'm gonna try and be in the chat. We'll see. We did, you know, we do the decorations thing up in this house still. So we got some stuff to do.
Yeah. No, we got both my children are home now. We got plans. So yeah, it's gonna be a busy day. But yeah, I might pop up in the chat myself.
Even though you don't like to hear yourself.
I really don't, but the more I've had to edit to edit video and stuff like that, it's kind of unavoidable. So I've just sort of resigned to the fact that there are certain traits and tics that I have that I'm just not, they're just always going to irritate me. It's just going to have to we just ask that everybody accept the good with the little bit of the bad, you know what it is, you know? So like, but there are things that I do that I catch in editing that are really annoying, but I can't catch it live.
So you don't realize you're doing it live?
I can't. And then
when you edit?
No. I really? Hear it all. I see it all. Yeah. And it's live. I can't catch it. And there's some things that are just unavoidable. So I've just resigned to the fact that it's just okay. I'm just going to have to. The only good thing I will say to your previous point about that I've felt about getting older is that my my ego is just, I'm just so humbled at this point. I almost don't care anymore. But so it's on that level, it's fine. Like I don't have the same ego that I once had about what I thought was my public facing presentation. Now I don't even care. So, but but I'm just like, yeah, there it is again. He did it again in the edits, and it's like, mm,
Oh well.
oh well.
That's funny.
So yeah. But and then sometimes what I'll do is I watch something else. If it's like a replay or a pre-tape, I'll have something else on that I'm listening to, but I'll watch the chat so that I actually have to watch and hear myself. I can just see the chat and respond if necessary. Maybe I'll do it that way. We'll see.
That's actually usually what I do, because I think it's more because just re-listening to the conversation is, I don't know.
I just said that.
Right. It's too much.
I don't need to hear it again. I just said that. So, but then with the guest we have today, though, I don't know. It might be necessary to re-listen because the levels and the depth and the layered content sometimes for me requires multiple listens. So maybe we'll see.
It'd be a lot of bars dropping whenever Lawrence comes. So, I'm for it. But I realized this morning we have not invited Devon back in a while. And I wonder sometimes, like, does Devon look and be like, they always be bringing Lawrence back? So we gotta
yeah. Do they have internal LBS competition? Do they have little how you get to? I something tells me they don't. These cats come. They I think they're too serious for all of that.
And they're too busy. But
busy too. They winning victories. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We might hear an update. I feel like I saw a pretty decent announcement the other day that I feel like they can claim credit for. But
All right. Well, I guess let's not wait any longer.
Stand on ceremony and bring back to the stage Lawrence Grandpre, Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Did I get? Wait.
It's Director of Research.
That's right. Man,
yeah.
See, man.
Yeah.
Hey, man. It's only been 15, 20 years of this. I'll get it eventually. But good to see you again, Lawrence. Welcome back. Please, folks, if you're not familiar, Leaders of Beautiful Struggle, lbsbaltimore.com. Link will be in the show description. And welcome back, Lawrence. Good to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
So even though you're like a regular now, which I fully appreciate, we should still, I think, do the bare bones, at least, intro of the who you are, where you're at, what you do, things, so that in case folks are new to the channel, they know who you are.
Yeah, sure. So being here in Baltimore, born and raised, I went to high school here, did debate. The debate is the type of debate we did is multiple forms of debate. It's a two-person form of debate called policy debate. Very research focused. It's one topic for the whole country on federal government policy, so like ocean policy or energy policy. And this actually form of debate was invested in by Open Society Foundation, like George Soros, in the 90s. It's an expensive form of debate because before technology, Zoom and all that, you had to travel like to tournaments across the country, like AAU. You need a coach. It's very specialized. So they brought this form of debate to schools that didn't typically have money or resources for debate. It was called the Urban Debate Leagues. I mean, they still exist. And the idea was, two-person form of debate. It's highly research-based, but was almost more sort of like a literacy, attendance, and even some of the ways they talked about like a conflict resolution framework. It's like, it's a two-person form of debate, so they got to learn teamwork, cooperation. It was never thinking about what the pedagogy and culture of this community actually was. This form of debate was actually created by West Point, the military academy. So if you ever seen the great debaters, like public speaking to the community, that's not this form of debate. It's a highly technical, highly policy form of debate that's like built to produce Cold War think tank warriors. So like Liz Warren did the style of debate, like it's a policy wonk style of debate where everything you talked about, the goal was to link it to somehow could lead to nuclear war if the judge doesn't vote for you and pass the policy you want them to pass. So the joke was black kids would come and talk about addressing racism, and the other team would be like, spending money to address racism will destroy the economy, lead to nuclear war, through economic recession, and nuclear war outweighs racism. And because of like the culture and the mindset of the judges, black kids would lose those debates and be like, yeah, nuclear war outweighs racism. So there was a intellectual pedagogical intervention into the space by black elders, really born out of the Pan-African Studies Department at University of Louisville, or Louisville, that's how they pronounce it. So Eddie Warner was director of the debate team at the time, included folks like Daryl Birch, and it's like kids from places like Baltimore would come to Louisville and learn this style of debate where they brought in personal experience, organic intellectual, spoken word, Pan-African theory, critical race theory, and actually challenged the structures of debate itself, like not debate about the topic, but debate about debate and how judges judge debates and like the seduction of Cold War epistemologies in debate. And that style of debate, that intervention, produced the first team of 2 black women to actually get to the Elite 8 of the debate national championships. And then one of the students who was from Baltimore, who went to Louisville, Devin Cooper, transferred back to Towson to debate with Davon Love, and the coach was Daryl Birch, also from Louisville, and they were the first 2-person team of black debaters to win a college debate national championship in 2008. So when you're in this activity, they're debating and beating, elite schools, Northwestern, Harvard, Emory, Wake Forest. These people are literally going to DC and working at Center for American Progress, but also some of them like Heritage Foundation. Some of them do work in like design and think tanks. And that's what they're doing. Like they're creating the policy framework for the whole nation, like writing bills for senators and congressmen, writing policy briefs, shifting discourse, building consensus around sort of intellectual hegemony around how to think about the world. And we're like, well, we have the skill set and no one's doing that from our perspective from this form of debate. So I didn't do the critical form of debate. I did a more traditional form of debate. And I went to a school after I graduated from City College High School in Baltimore on the West Coast called Whitman College. And basically I had been teaching debate camp with folks like Davon and Devin and Adam. Folks will come on to basically be the founders of LBS. And it was like, well, I have all this knowledge from how traditional debate teams use these intellectual tricks and techniques to try to diffuse and defeat the more race critical style of debate. It's like you can use that research skill to help us be able to defeat what they do to diffuse our arguments. Because, they accuse you of cheating. They say capitalism comes before class. They used to like to read Paul Gilroy, The Black Atlantic, Hybridity, and the race essentialism. And it'd be funny because every time we would debate like Harvard, it'd be like, oh, this will be an easy debate because they're going to read Gilroy. We're going to smash Gilroy. We're going to win, right? And so, so doing that in the debate world, it's like, well, we're going to go off campus. We're going to do community organizing to lead a beautiful struggle. You help with the research for debate. Can you help with that for the work we're doing off campus? And that was 15 years ago. So for the past 15 years, my goal as director of research has been to basically add what I could to my lived experience and research skills to the advocacy campaigns around police accountability, the work we did around the Baltimore uprising, repealing the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights, stopping the construction of a proposed $100 million youth jail for youth charged as adults. A lot of the work I've been doing is around drug policy, doing research around drug decriminalization with the Reparations for the War on Drugs framework, the link between enforcement of drug policy and creating the conditions that allow for community violence and gun violence in our communities through mass incarceration and disrupting communities. That kind of leads into like overdose prevention and sort of alternative approaches to harm reduction and treatments from African-centered perspectives. And that's kind of wanted to focus on a lot of the war on drug stuff because, as you know, as you mentioned, wanted to talk about, my father was the Baltimore Police Department for 20 years and did, including in that undercover narcotics work. So like the stuff you see on The Wire was stuff he was doing in the 80s and 90s and stuff I was growing up around. So just some of those experiences, seeing my family and my father go through that, I think just kind of naturally meant a lot of my research would gravitate to the war on drugs, the impacts of the war on drugs, addiction, policing, and kind of how to build out community institutions to repair that harm.
I love that Lawrence gave us all of that and then sipped his coffee or tea or whatever.
I was just juice.
It's just juice.
Yeah, no, I'm fighting off the cold just like you. So it's a little bit of cranberry juice. Getting the
There
vitamin
you
C.
go. So you mentioned it, but this has come up in our various conversations because your mother was also involved in law enforcement, correct?
She was a state trooper for a few years. She ended up spending the majority of her career being a teacher. But for a few years during the 80s, she was a state trooper as well.
Okay. So the question that I've always had is how did that translate for you? Like to grow up in a house where your father was deeply embedded in the process against which you are now fighting. So how does that transition happen? I'm curious.
Yeah, I don't think it's as jarring as I think a lot of people would imagine it to be. So my father was born in New Orleans. I think he lived in LA for a while, grew up largely in New York. So his father, in Harlem in the 60s actually had an assault that was pretty bad. So one of the things that, as a black man facing, the possibility of being drafted, it's like, I got to feed my family. I want to protect my community. One of the few ways I have to do that is to join the police force. So he did that in the 70s, but that was just like the birth of the war on drugs, right? So as the 80s rolls around, he's gone through the academy. He's starting to see changes in the police force. So after he retires, he would tell me things that I say a lot is that to the extent that, in his mind as a cop, he viewed the job as, someone who was trying to be in community, trying to help protect community. Now, we know that the structures of police don't really allow for that. But in his experience, he said the war on drugs taught a generation of cops how to not do the job. To the extent there is anything police can do, there's a small segment of our community that does prey upon community, that does commit acts of violence, and you need a certain form of something in community to deal with that. And if it's policing, to actually achieve that objective, you would need to do things like cultivate community trust, build the ability to cultivate confidential informants. Like if someone does violate community in a way that, just commits to act of violence that violates community norms. A lot of people can't go to police because it's like there's no trust at all there. It's a more of a violation to community to go to police than it was to ignore the violence. You can't, he would talk about, you have to actually be able to know how to testify and actually know how to keep a chain of evidence and not contaminate it. Like you can't be corrupt. You can't plant evidence. But the war on drugs taught people that the only thing that would get them promoted, that would get them more pay bumps, to get them more salary, seniority, political security within the department was putting dope on the table. Like if you've seen The Wire, like being able to deliver drug busts, whether it's, locking someone up for selling you a dime bag of a bottle of crack cocaine, or just being able to put dope on the table through, just small level dealers, planting drugs on people, just claiming to make arrests. That was the only thing that mattered. And so much money began flowing in the police department that he has a story that I think I've told on this platform before, where it was like they give you walking around money and you're paying confidential informants. You're doing the things you need to do to get information. And they told him, you can do anything with this money. You can use it to put money on the streets to get information. You could take it to a strip club. You could buy dinner with it. The one thing you can't do is bring it back to the police department. And it's like, well, why is that? And when you think about it, it makes sense because in their minds, they're going to ask for more money every single year, no matter what. So no matter whether they need it, no matter whether it makes sense to spend it on whatever they spend the money on, they're going to ask for more money every single year, no matter what. So the one thing they can't do is not spend every single dollar that the politicians give them. So it literally did not matter what he was doing with the money. He just had to not bring it back. And when you see that, it's like, oh, this is a hustle. That's one thing you understand growing up with cops is that they hustle us. Their job is to make it look like they're the only thing protecting society from anarchy and chaos. Some of them believe that. Some people like my father don't necessarily believe that, but it's part of the hustle that you gotta be into to survive in the police world, right? He would also talk about, it's just so many cops, so little accountability that people will walk around with a giant manila folder full of paper. And no one's going to ask you what you're doing because you look busy having a giant folder full of paper, and the paper would just be literal blank printer paper, right? So people are literally just walking around doing nothing, but because they got a big folder of printer paper in the manila folder, nobody asks them what they're doing for that job, right? So it's just like all these different inside things you understand about how cops think, how policing infrastructure actually works, that really honestly helps me in my critique of policing, right? Because you understand it's not about the individual people. They come from all different walks of life. Some of them want to be violent and have a control complex, a God complex, and that's where they get to express it. Some of them are basically economic drafted in police the way people are economic drafted in the military, right? But the mechanism of policing, it doesn't really matter who's in there. When you have no accountability, when you have no mechanism to check bad behavior, all of the incentives lead to playing fast and loose with the rules and playing fast and loose with the use of force. Like when you know there's a small possibility that someone on the streets could take your gun and shoot you. That's what people forget. When you have a gun as a cop, and you are taught if you lose a fight, you die. Because the thinking is whoever's going to take you down is going to steal your gun and shoot you with it. So when you have 15, 21, 22, 23-year-olds armed with guns, thousands of them, lightly trained, they're going to be trigger happy because in their minds, they're afraid if they get knocked down, if someone tackles them, they're dead. And if they know they're not going to lose their job, they're not going to lose their pension, they're not going to lose their pay bump for pulling the trigger because they have excellent lawyers for the Fraternal Order of Police. The Fraternal Police literally has some of the best lawyers in the state. And not only do they fight against them going to jail, they fight against them getting punished within the department. Like one thing, again, I say all the time, being raised by cops, you realize they're not afraid of going to jail. And we can do a bunch of stuff, but it's going to be hard to make them afraid of going to jail because they know the law is stacked in their favor. They're afraid of losing, not even their job sometimes, but their pay bumps. They're afraid of not getting promoted. They're afraid of losing seniority. They're afraid of losing access to promotion. So we understood that the internal disciplinary process within the police department was actually going to be one of the more proximate deterrents to bad police behavior, right? Because in their minds, they're like, I'd rather be judged by 9 than carried by 6. Like I'd rather be judged by the jury than have people carry my casket. And the only thing that's going to intervene in that is like, you're going to be alive, but you're going to be broke. You're going to lose the pleasure you get feeling like a provider for your family. You're going to lose your tickets to the Ravens game or the Orioles game because we're going to bump you down to the pay grade you had 5 years ago because these uses of excessive force prevent you from advancing in the department. Like those are the things that can actually deter the negative behavior. And that's the stuff cops care about. Just being raised by cops, you begin to see is like, because I know what they care about, I know how to actually apply mechanisms of deterrence to actually be able to pull some of the levers to deter negative police behavior. That's why we focus so much on independent investigatory power for police accountability boards, not just having to rely on internal affairs. Because not only are internal affairs, they're still cops, they're just completely overwhelmed in terms of the firepower they have compared to the FOP. Like literally the FOP is bringing out the top defense lawyers in the state for an internal disciplinary hearing. And the FOP is like literally putting Sharpie on a whiteboard trying to explain to folks what happened. And the FOP has in like private investigators. They have videos, they have propaganda videos that they're not showing a jury, they're showing other cops on the internal disciplinary board. So it's like, okay, we got to get these cops off the internal disciplinary board and put some civilians on there because there's no way internal affairs even has a shot when literally cops are judging other cops, right? So knowing that policing isn't perfect, knowing that we want to push for an abolitionist mindset, but understanding that if we're going to have to transition away from the policing we have now to some new institutions that are fundamentally different in terms of how they function, what are the mechanisms and levers we can pull. And I think being raised by cops helped me to understand some of the value of some of the approaches we've taken at LBS over the past 15 years.
That is, I mean, it makes total sense that being on the inside, in the sense of like having a family member who's on the inside, would give you the tools to be able to do the work that you do. But I guess I'm also curious, like, what is it that made, so I also know a lot of, I have no cops in my, close family, right? I'm sure there's one out there somewhere. But um what so you hear a lot of times like, well, my dad was a cop, my grandfather was a cop, so I had to be a cop. Like there's so what is it that for you made you say, "Oh, I'm not participating in this. I'm gonna fight it instead." Because there's a decision there that gets made, right?
Yeah. I think part of it was just being more of a bookish child. The goal was to do better than your parents, and I understood that there was nothing romantic about police work in my mind. I mean, if I'm, false memories potentially exist, but I think I remember seeing my father bring crime scene photos home and seeing stuff he wasn't supposed to see in crime scene photos. Um, I also just saw the psychological toll it played on him. Like, he has really bad PTSD. And I thought he was in the Vietnam War for a long time and then became a cop. Because sometimes the jungle movies would come on, jungle warfare movies, and he would have a visceral reaction to it. And again, a story that I think I mentioned before, it was not Vietnam. In the early 90s, Pablo Escobar in Colombia, it was illegal to send U.S. troops to Colombia to fight Pablo Escobar. What you could do is send police officers to Colombia to train them on drug interdiction and send military people like the Navy SEALs to protect those cops, right? And of course, it was all a front. It was just a front to send the Navy SEALs into Colombia to go after Pablo Escobar. And my father was apparently one of those cops that got sent on one of those missions. So he was in Colombia doing drug interdiction training with the Navy SEALs as they were going after Pablo. And my father being my father, he's like, I'm not going to have somebody protecting me and not do something to protect myself. Because, like, they were cops. They didn't have to do nothing, I think, apparently, right? But it's like, no, it's like, I'm not going to have somebody shoot for me and not shoot for myself. So he was there in Colombia in the jungle shooting guns to go after Pablo Escobar because the Navy SEALs were doing it, right? And it was just, like, really traumatic. And again, we had no understanding of this. This was, like, a secret. Like, he told me at the end of his life, like, I didn't want to tell nobody because I feel like I burnt enough bridges and got enough trouble as it was. I didn't want to do more stuff, right? Because he also apparently was a whistleblower. Not like I don't think he was a police brutality whistleblower. I think he was more like, there are corrupt things happening in the police department. People are taking money and not doing work. So I remember seeing him on the news with his face blacked out, talking about how there's something wrong in the police department. And then, like, my parents made a big deal about us watching it. So he had a strong sense of, like, if we're going to do the work, right? And that did not get him very far in the police department, right? He had a lot of issues getting his 20 years to get his pension because, he was basically on the brink of getting kicked out, even though he was, like, pretty good at what he did. So it's like, when you see that, it's like, thank you for doing that to feed me. And I don't want no one to have to do that. So I think it's not just me not wanting to do it. It is, like, part of the reason I focus so much on alternatives to community safety and violence prevention is that if you have this desire to protect your community, being a cop cannot be the only way to manifest that desire in the world. Because as that institution is now, it's not safe for our community. It's not safe for them, right? It is not any way conducive to humanity, that institution. And I didn't have the theoretical framing to understand that. I just understood seeing what it did to my father. Like, he aged really quickly, and had a lot of coping mechanisms to deal with his trauma that were not good for his health. And I think it was just very clear understanding that, like, that institution, it demystifies the institution, even the myths about cop solidarity, thin blue line. Like, they don't even stand up for each other. So how could they stand up for our community? You know what I mean? So I think it was just, like, painfully clear that, like, that institution has been rotted by the money, by the power, by the lack of accountability. And it just really solidifies the deep understanding that institution cannot survive as it is. Because really, again, you can have, like, I was raised to believe a death of a cop was a death in the family. So that's, like, the level of, like, policeism I was raised with. And if someone like me can come to the conclusions that I think is, like, very clearly, like, this institution is not conducive for humanity and health. And then, it's pretty obvious to see, well, if I see a death of a cop, it's a death in the family, then I see the death of Freddie Gray or Mike Brown or Trayvon Martin. That's also what deaths in my family as well. So the way mechanism of how I deal with that is like, we have this family of African people. We do need some mechanism of protection for our community, but it can't be police. We got to have something else. So when we talk about grassroots violence prevention, I am very explicit. I wanted to replace police. The people in the industry have been very adamant that's not what they want it to be, because they need to say that to get the money. So I think it's our job to make the argument, no, if this institution exists and is working, and we can explain why it's working and defend it, then we can take some of the money from police and put it into violence prevention, because that money it's building a political juggernaut that is then going to destroy anything like grassroots violence prevention that can work that's not police. So it strengthens my desire example to like make violence prevention part of a defund argument, to push defund as, even though it's seen as a political non-starter in the new Democratic Party, because again, that institution of policing, it's not going to stop. It's going to gobble up all the resources like Pac-Man, because that's how they think. And I know that's how they think because I was raised by them, right? They do not let no one else take credit for nothing, because in their mind it is an existential threat to the institution of policing for anyone else to get credit for public safety. Even though they'll say things like, we're not social workers, we need help, we're not teachers, they need good parenting. When you start talking about putting money into that from them, it's like, well, don't do that. Fund us and fund the other stuff. I don't know how, because we take up, a huge chunk of the budget, but figure it out. It's like, no, that's not possible. That you're expanding into surveillance and bringing civilians into police department to run like social media monitoring. You're hooking up with Palantir. You're doing the surveillance network. So they're doing nothing but expand. They think like capitalists. Like the institution works like a capitalist institution, grow or die. And it works like cancer, right? So it's like individual cops have no ability to fight that inertia. So it can't be nothing like a good cop changing that institution. That's like a good cancer cell fighting cancer. Like it can't happen. So we have to apply the pressure in order to change that, because that institution, seeing it up close, is so unconducive to like actual human flourishing and human life, even for the people locked in it, especially for the people locked in it.
All right. So, one, I really appreciate you being candid about this, because I think a lot of times for people, and this includes me, so let me not speak too much in third person. Like I always look at policing and all these things as like, why do you even do it? But you said something earlier that has been like replaying in my head about being drafted into the police the way you get drafted into the military. And I don't think I've ever heard anybody say it like that before. And it makes so much sense when you put it that way, to consider that economic role, right? That whole idea that like you'll get a steady paycheck, you'll be in the union, you can retire after 20 years, like, that it does play a role. And it's unfortunate because, as you said, like the whole thing is rotten to, like whenever people tell me the bad apple thing, I'm like, it's not the apple, it's not even the tree, it is the whole freaking orchard and the ground that that it's like, seated in, and the air around it and the irrigation system, like everything about it is rotten to the core. And so, one, you being candid about your dad is really, I really appreciate it. And this take on violence prevention as an argument for defunding, I'm loving this. And I don't know, this is like our third conversation, and I don't know if it's just that you haven't voiced it that way or what, but for some reason I feel like this is like a new understanding for me for how the battle needs to work. So could you talk a little bit more about how community programs can fight this battle. Because so in Newark last week, and I meant to email you actually when I caught word of this, there was a like 3 organizations were like, we're just going to have a meeting because we need to have a conversation about violence prevention and what we're going to do for ourselves in Newark. And I couldn't go because I was sick, but it's basically like the start of trying to work, for multiple organizations to try to work together. And I meant to email you because I lost my note of like the groups in Newark that you told me to look into. I can't find it this is the problem with being old and writing everything down in a composition notebook. It's in a notebook somewhere. I just can't find the note. So I meant to email you. But can you talk about like how this works from the ground level of doing this violence prevention work?
Yeah.
If that question makes sense.
Yeah, so I'll link it to the policing experience and also try to link it to some of the stuff on reparations. And we want to talk about that as well. It's not very popular to be like legalize all drugs. Some of the very few people that make that argument are police officers, because in their model, they say, look, in this unregulated market, it creates, like, if someone steals your drugs, you owe your plug. Your plug can't go to the police to get their money back. They're going to do violence against you to deter someone from stealing from you. So in that world, like, my father was one of those folks. I don't think he ever said, he may have actually said, yeah, we need to legalize the stuff, because being a drug warrior, it's like, it's not working, right? But I think those conditions of violence in our community is not just the drug game. It is the impacts of the war on drugs creating a cycle of incarceration that destabilizes our communities. So when you're sending someone in and out of jail, in and out of jail, in and out of jail, they're losing much of their connection they have socially is being frayed by that incarceration experience. That opportunity to get employment that's not in the underground economy is getting frayed because of that separation. And also, like, the work they do to sustain the people around them is cut off. Like, those people who are in the drug game are also buying pamphlets, they're paying light bills, they're paying rent. And that just destabilizes the entire community. So when you see violence in communities that have a high level of drug arrest, and this is research that we've done, it's not the drug gang per se that's driving all of that violence. Like, especially today, like, it's not the 90s no more. This is not The Wire beefing over crack corners. There's a lot less money in those streets, so it's a lot less reason to kill over those corners. Most of it is when you destabilize communities so much, you create conditions where relatively minor community beefs, like I mentioned all the time, like, you have a sister and somebody dating your sister, and your sister says they did her dirty, right? You going after the same girl. Someone said something about you on the internet, said something about your people on the internet, right? Those things create conditions where relatively minor community beefs, because everyone's under so much pressure, under so much trauma. And it's not, like, again, because you're in the streets per se selling drugs, but because, you are living an economic precarious lifestyle, you're moving from house to house, you're getting evicted. All these things create the environment where violence happens. So when you think about what violence prevention folks actually do, is serve as a conduit of information, like street diplomacy. Like, that's part of the actual explicit framework they used in the gang truce between the Bloods and the Crips in LA in the 90s, was doing a form of diplomacy a la like the Middle East peace process, right? And part of the value of diplomacy is sharing information, because lines of information are often cut off between warring nations and between not gangs, not like Bloods and Crips, but like warring crews, warring community groups. And what happens, and I've seen people say this, is like, I don't want to hurt that brother, I don't want to shoot that brother or sister, but I don't know if they want to hurt or shoot me, so I feel the pressure to strike first. It's just like, the global diplomacy, preemptive strikes. So what violence prevention can, one of the things they can do is serve as a conduit of information. The Cold War, US and Soviet Union used to have these red phones, the red line. They could hop on the phone and talk to each other and be like, that we see a missile being shot at us. No, it's a weather balloon, right? So it's the same thing. It's like, I see you taking a shot at me on the internet. It's like, no, that wasn't for you. That was for a whole nother person. Like, don't even trip over that. And you have credible people who are formerly in street organizations, who are many of them formerly incarcerated, many of them doing work behind bars, and then being released into community, in part because of the criminal justice reforms that have happened over the past 15 years. So things like the Second Look Act here in Maryland that just passed, things like the Unger decisions, things like decriminalizing and changing, allowing people to get their sentences around cannabis looked at and re-adjudicated. There's a lot of folks coming home who had been mediating conflict behind bars, and now they're in community, and now we have the opportunity to pay them through this community-based violence intervention credible messenger model to go into community and squash beefs before they happen, right? So I think that's an example of like the structural role they play in actually preventing violence from happening, because a lot of people talk about preventing retaliation when a shooting happens, and that's important, but that's actually downstream. That's after the shooting has happened. So you got folks in hospitals going to people who have been shot or stabbed up being like, hey, you can go back on the streets and either get shot or shoot somebody, or, you know, we can get you services, we can change your life around. We have people working with people in different ways, but the groups we specifically work with are folks who explicitly do not work with police, because some of these groups feel pressure to work with police because that's where the money is. The nonprofit institutions are being told that it's only through working with police that this model can work, but the data they use to support that is actually terrible. We actually did a whole podcast on Black Liberation Media on our political commentary corner channel that talks about the data they're using to support this "you gotta work with police" argument. It's from like a white dude who hung up with Latino gangs in the 60s and did some really, really shoddy scholarship they keep citing over and over again to make this argument. Because the groups we work with not only do not work with police explicitly, they and again, it's like some of the folks in Newark that I told you about, like Newark Community Street Team, they explicitly say they do not work with police and they believe the war on drugs is an extension of slavery. And they also engage with groups that use a cultural, spiritual approach to how they work with people in community. Because the notion of credible messengers comes from like the work that Black Panthers did in the 60s and 70s, going in community and interrupting beefs. The Nation of Islam has been doing this work for decades, using an extension of that argument about, you know, the Black man is the original man, the Black man is God. You need to embrace your own sense of self-worth, because your ability to shoot someone who looks like you is an extension of the injected oppression that teaches you to devalue African people, that African people are marks and suckers, so that robbing them is like waking them up, you know, and you're mimicking the white man's relationship to the Black man, how you relate to your community. People that use these more explicit political, cultural frameworks for the work have not only been very effective, but also have a lot of credibility in our community for representing a vision of leadership and community that we want to see invested in. But what we know is that the business community that wants to invest in these programs, not because they care about our community, but because the shootings make it hard to gentrify our cities, they don't want that approach to be central, because those folks are not in the pocket of the business community. They don't play well with the academics and the nonprofit public health institutions they want to dominate this work. And they're more open to an argument that, well, if this violence prevention stuff works, then why do we need, in Baltimore, it's like $600 million a year for the police department in a $2 billion a year budget. Why do we need that much money in a world where the numbers of police on the streets have been declining, not because of these funds, but because of retirements, and no one wants to be a cop because the word is out that it's a crappy job. But with less cops in the streets than before, less murders than ever. So it's not the cops causing this murder decline. What's happened is we have a brand new multi-million-dollar investment in these community-based violence prevention programs that have cut the murders in Baltimore by more than 50% this year. We're going to probably come in around 160 murders after a high of like 350 a couple years ago. And so again, if that's working, and it's not just dealing with shootings, but also talking to people about, they have a Stop the Beef hotline, the group we support here in Baltimore, We Are Us, that's dealing with bullying and domestic violence and a bunch of stuff that's not shootings that could lead to shootings if it doesn't get checked. They're doing so much work upstream that cops just can't do. Not just because they're not credible, but because they're not trained to do it, and it doesn't make any sense for them to do it. So in that world, if they can't do that work, and that work is what's necessary, then if we put more funding into that work, doesn't it make sense that it would achieve the results that cops can't achieve? And we know cops are able to, any deterrent effect from policing is highly speculative and does not scale with funding. More funding for cops, more police in the street does not mean more deterrence for violent crime. And that's pretty robustly proven. And any effect they have is marginal in the data. So again, if we need money for this preventative work, and cops are like the single biggest part of our local municipal budget, doesn't it make sense to shift some of that funding from cops being on the streets, being in their cars, not even engaging community, just like literally just sitting in their cars doing nothing, to people actually walking the streets, engaging community, doing food giveaways, doing backpack giveaways, practically engaging community? And when you actually talk to people that say defund is not popular, when you say, should we shift resources from the police to community-based programming to actually improve conditions, it's actually far more popular, and is specifically popular amongst the Black people who do not like the phrase defund in the abstract. So we have a lot of like white liberals and even white progressives saying defund is bad messaging, and not even listening to the argument that when you explicitly say, when you fund Black people to do Black people's work of protecting our community, and should we shift some money from the police budget to that, it is specifically Black people that respond to that framing of the defund argument. And I think that's part of the work we have to do, because so much of the energy now is just to shift away from that frame of analysis. And I think that, again, that also is a reparations frame of investing in community in the way that community controls the resources and invest in things that build up the community. And I think, again, even some of our liberal progressive allies have anxieties about that framing of defund around community sovereignty and community control. And I think that's part of the value of centering reparations as part of this shifting resources and public safety argument.
Before I do want to ask you to about, as I sort of teased at the beginning, this victory that I think LBS played a large role in. But before we do that, Renee a minute ago mentioned the her notebooks, and I did dig up footage of one of our meetings to discuss Renee's notebooks that I thought I would share with the audience here. So just bear with me here for a second.
We could use some more men here.
Hey man, I'm doing the best I can. You get with all this.
There are 2,000 notebooks on these shelves, and each notebook contains about 250 pages.
Get it? Anything about the killing?
So that's the kind of work we're dealing with here with Renee. You need teams working in shifts to go through her notebooks. So if she misses something or misplaces a note, that's what we got to go through.
Well, thank God we have AI, so she can scan them.
Exactly. We could just
the African-centered algorithm.
The bad part is that's literally, if you could see the stacks of used, and then I keep new ones. So when there's a sale on composition notebooks, I buy notebooks so I never run out. It's bad. It's bad, y'all. It's bad.
So yeah, that's what it looks like. And of course, the killing that was being referenced there is just, these police killings. So, but Renee leaves notes everywhere, and we got shifts of people working. But Lawrence, you did mention this issue of reparations, and I know we're trained in radical spaces, as Cabral said, not to claim easy victories, and to not lose sight of the grand revolutionary prize. But I admit, I'm not going to front, and maybe this is just my creeping liberalism in my old age, but when I saw you all post that the Maryland legislature overturned Westmore's veto of a reparations bill, I had a little smirk. I wouldn't say I did, wasn't out here dancing in the streets or anything, but there was a little bit of like a, hey, all right, that's what I'm telling you. There it is. And but could you just tell us what first of all, what the reparations bill is here in Maryland, and then what this again, and describe it if the word victory isn't appropriate or isn't, or maybe you think it's insufficient. Please describe what you think this is and tell us what actually happened here.
Okay, so I'll set the stage. So 2024, people had talked about reparations, and we have a meeting with the governor's team. We do a lot of advocacy in Annapolis, so there are people tied to the governor's team that we have a meeting with. And we presented not a study bill. We presented a progressive taxation economic redistribution bill to pay for reparations. So like closing loopholes that companies use in Maryland to not pay local Maryland business tax, and also progressive raises on income tax to actually go to a fund explicitly to redress historical harm. The governor's team said, that's not the approach we want to take. We want to focus on things that the governor's already doing and building that up. So they mentioned the Enough Act. It's like $10 million a year fund that people apply for to get money for community programs, right? So part of the governor's whole argument is that I don't want to study it, I want to do it. It's like, well, we came to you with a plan to do it, and you said you wanted to focus more on stuff you were already doing. So we pivoted in some ways to support the Black folks in the Black Caucus of Maryland who were pushing a reparations study bill. Now, again, we had and have anxieties about study bills because our big thing is we can study it, but where's the money? But given the momentum around needing to do something, people wanting us to help, and the idea of using a study not just to study the harm, which I think we can say we may have already done in Maryland, but to especially study how to pay for the solutions, it's like, okay, we can hop on that. We can make this study bill useful. So that's what we wrote up in 2025. We helped Delegate Althea McCaskill in the House of Delegates and Senator Muse in the Senate. They both had versions of a reparations study bill that would impanel a commission through the Maryland State Archives. They're using archival information that we didn't have access to 20, 30 years ago. Like we know Johns Hopkins was a slave owner. Didn't know that 20, 30 years ago. To actually be able to build up information to categorize not just the harm of slavery, but the study mechanisms of solutions, and especially ways to have solutions that would stand up to the legal challenges we know are coming. So Ed Bloom, the lawsuit of the Fearless Fund, any race-based policy you pass is going to be challenged by conservative con law, the conservative legal army. So having mechanisms that actually, like we did with the Reparations War on Drugs bill, we had that focused on cannabis arrests, and that be the mechanism to determine how much localities get for funding, because we knew talking about race explicitly would have a legal challenge. So something like that, but for the larger harm of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, specifically in the state of Maryland. So that study bill passed the House and the Senate. And before it passed, the governor's team had said they don't want to focus on reparations. They had not explicitly told us or other people they were explicitly against studying reparations. And so the bill is at the 5-yard line in the Maryland legislature in Annapolis. And we're starting to hear word that the governor's team's against it, like straight up against it. So against it, they are trying to kill it. And it looked like it might die, actually. But then at some point, people are like, forget it. We'll just pass it. This is late. He's coming out of nowhere with this. If he's going to veto it, he'll veto it. We'll just pass it. They veto it. Well, they pass it. And it's like, is he going to veto it? Is he going to veto it? And the governor does indeed veto the bill, making this argument that, like, I don't need to study it. I want to just act. And then that being the framework to which he defends the veto over months and months and months on media, podcasts, things like that. Now, in Maryland, as we did with Republican governors very often, you can override a governor's veto because we're a Democratic supermajority in the House and the Senate. And you actually need 3/5. So you need 60% of the House and the Senate to override the veto. Our plan was to take up this advocacy really next year in January, because all laws in Maryland passed in 100 days from January to April in Annapolis. But our leader of the House of Delegates, Adrienne Jones, actually stepped down from being in leadership. So she's still a delegate, but she's no longer the Speaker of the House. So they needed to appoint a new speaker and wanted to do it before the new year kicked over. So they actually called a special session this Tuesday. So before they're supposed to come back in January, they had a special session only on Tuesday. And by the Constitution of Maryland says, whenever you come into session, you have to take up the veto overrides. It's the first thing you do before you can do any other work. So even though the goal was basically really to replace Speaker Jones with a new speaker, we have a new speaker from Prince George's County, Jocelyn Pillier-Melnick, they had to take up the veto override votes on Tuesday. So we basically shifted everything from holiday mode to publicity mode, telling people to, tune in, tell your lawmaker, tell them you want them to support the veto override. And on Tuesday, the House and the Senate of Maryland voted with a over 60% majority to override the governor's veto, which means that despite his veto, we will indeed have a commission in Maryland on studying the harms of slavery and other related Jim Crow inequities to create a document in 2027 that's supposed to inform legislative recommendations to be taken up in 2028 around reparations in the state of Maryland. So that's what happened this week in Maryland. So I do think it is a victory in part because the Black Caucus, which, like the Congressional Black Caucus, has often in the past been a rubber stamp for political leadership, over the past really 6-7 years, advocacy from many folks in Maryland, I think including us, has really pushed the Black Caucus to be more independent and be more progressive, right? So like we don't have a progressive caucus in Maryland, in part because when people raised the idea, we said, well, that most of the things progressive caucus would take up impact Black people disproportionately. But it would mean a bunch of non-Black legislators claiming to be progressive, taking leadership on issues that impact us. We just need to make the Black caucus more progressive and more powerful. And people said, they're not serious. They have not been a force. Don't pay attention to them. And we said, no, we're going to engage them. We're going to critique them. We're going to hold them accountable. And when it makes sense, we're going to give them credit. So when they stood firm and passed a bill that prevented odor alone, the sole smell of odor, to be an excuse for legal arrest of traffic stops here in Maryland, and made that evidence inadmissible if odor of cannabis alone was the justification for the stop, because we know that's a tool used for driving while Black and searching people's cars. The Black Caucus stood firm on that. And that's not something that many people think would have happened 5 years ago, right? And I think it's just a lot of pressure to the point when the veto happened, the Black Caucus felt empowered enough, but also enough pressure, enough sense that they would be looked at, they would be critiqued, and maybe even people would look at some of their folks in the primary to be able to say, look, we got to stand firm on this. People are coming to us saying they want to study reparations, and we made it a caucus priority. And that's supposed to mean something when you have the largest Black caucus in the nation. So again, I think that it's easy to dismiss Black lawmakers, especially when you see what they do at a national level. But I think at the local level, we have folks who really have stood up to leadership and they've paid a price. They've been moved off of committees. The governor announced that he's potentially going to primary fellow Democrats in ways that, support people that support his agenda. That's not something that Democrats commonly do. And even in the midst of that, folks stood firm and were able to stand up on this bill, which again, it's not just about studying the harm, but building the case for future policy to actually stand up to strict scrutiny and pass solutions to its racial inequity. So I think that the real victory will be when we pass legislation influenced by the study and get that implemented. But I think this is a step that we need to take note of and give credit to, while we understand it's not the full victory. And that's going to require a lot more organizing pressure and work for us to get the policies that actually redress the harm. But to have this be the explicit frame for which those policies come, reparations isn't just funding for stuff. It's about building the capacity of people to practice sovereignty. And to have a bill that's really passed in that spirit, stand up to the governor's veto, I think is something that we should note and take stock of and build upon.
So I appreciate that. And this wasn't really on our list of conversation, but because you've mentioned the role of this specific group of local politicians, it brings me into my conundrum sphere of electoral politics and why electoral politics as a practice and as something to engage with in an attempt to push specific policies that are going to be positively impacting the material conditions of the people within a community or a vicinity or whatever we want to call it, locality, whatever. Can you, and I don't know how briefly you can do it, and it's something that we've discussed before, but I think it's worth revisiting. Can you talk about why engagement in policy practice with politicians is a worthwhile effort. Because I feel like what you just talked about is evidence that there's a space for this. But can you speak kind of more generally about this work that LBS does with politicians in order to enforce and force through policy and legislation?
Yeah. So I'll wrap it around something that I want to talk about anyway. So and I think it will get to answering your question. So part of the conversation I think is relevant to your question is like a legitimate concern raised by people like, why even talk about reparations? We know they don't care about it. We know they don't want to do it. We know white people not just gonna let us have it. So y'all talking about reparations is just begging the white man to pay attention to your oppression, and it's not really doing nothing. I think that that's along the lines of a, not just fatalistic argument around not engaging in politics, but like if you understand how power and racism works, this does not feel like a pragmatic approach from what I understand the world to be. I think that's legitimate criticism, and I think that our response to that is us living the answer to the argument as opposed to me just explaining it. So, like, what is reparations? Reparations is probably not going to be a $20 billion check from Maryland next year for all Black people. That's probably not going to happen. And if that's your metric for reparations, then yeah, what's the point? I think for us to go to reparations, it's not that cash payments are off the table. That's not what I'm saying either. But what it's going to look like, how it's going to be more incremental, it's just not as satisfying, it's not as cathartic. But if we actually see the progress we've made, we see a trajectory of meaningful, concrete, pragmatic, existing progress that improves people's lives because we've seen it here in Maryland. So just to set the framework, reparations, it's not about just funding for Black people or funding for stuff that Black people benefit from. It's not about getting access to mainstream institutions, even though some Black people might benefit from that. It's about the people who are harmed choosing for themselves the mechanism to address that harm. So from a Pan-African Black nationalist tradition, it's not just about funding like big white institutions to do stuff for Black people, because that can and does happen quite often, but that's not reparations. It's building the case for the people who have been harmed to choose for themselves the mechanisms of redress. And similarly, it's not about repairing the harm between the oppressor and the oppressed. It's about recognizing that when you talk about reparations, the people who were harmed had stuff before the harm happened. They had institutions, they had community, they had ways to address their basic needs of education, safety, food sovereignty. And it's about repairing those institutions embedded in those communities so that they can replicate the meeting of those needs, so that those communities are no longer entirely dependent upon the institutions of the oppressor. So that's what reparations is for us. And so the work we've been doing here in Baltimore, some of it's called reparations, some of it has not been called reparations, but it's explicitly built in that framework. So when we did the Baltimore State Children and Youth Fund, they wanted it just to be another grant program where white saviors control most of the money. They had a little pile of the money that was like community-based participatory budgeting, but most of it was just a regular grant program. We said no, all of it is going to be controlled by a Black institution. A new institution is going to be built explicitly with the framework of getting money to community-based institutions that typically do not get funding, and building upon those that use the culture and resources of the community, which in that case is the community impacted by the Baltimore uprising, to be able to build for themselves mechanisms to repair the harm of, in that case, the Baltimore uprising. So we see folks like Wombworks, which is a local-based theater troupe, getting money from the youth fund to put on plays about addiction and plays about the power of like cultural legacies that actually address the specific harms those communities have seen through policing. And they're just example after example, even though nothing is perfect, like the youth fund is not perfect, is a mechanism to get funding to Black grassroots institutions that typically have not gotten funding. Similarly with the Reparations to the War on Drugs Commission. So in Maryland, we wrote the law to actually get the funding, because when you have legal cannabis, you tax it. You do not tax medical cannabis because you don't tax medicine. But for recreational cannabis, you put an extra tax on it. Who controls that money? For us, it was obvious that the people impacted by the war on drugs have to control that money and choose for themselves the mechanisms of redress for the war on drugs. So we wrote a bill, gave it to Senator Jill Carter, who is the daughter of Walter Carter, former leader of Baltimore Congress of Racial Equality, civil rights, Black power legend, died young, but his daughter is a senator. We give her the bill for taking 35% of that money and putting it into a fund explicitly for reparations for the war on drugs, taking that money out of Annapolis, which is key, and putting it under local control of the communities most impacted by the war on drugs. So PG County, Baltimore City have a disproportionate amount of cannabis arrests, so they get a disproportionate amount of that 35% of all the tax money. And again, that's designed, again, pragmatically to stand up to legal scrutiny, but to disproportionately fund the communities that have the most need, i.e. the Black and Brownest communities. And it's under local control of a commission, but that commission is not just producing a report. That commission controls where this, for Baltimore City, $7 to $10 million a year goes in the communities most impacted by the war on drugs, not only for human social service grant programming, but to have it open to things that do like cooperative business, that do wealth generation, that do things like controlling land, things you typically can't do with public money. So when we talk about reparations, part of it is we're going to build containers that can actually handle large quantities of public money so that when we get a reparations policy and funding for it, there are places for it to go that isn't just a check that goes into people's pockets and it goes to Amazon, Walmart, and you more than anybody know the limits of the Black buying power argument, but community containers that have political power. So we may not be able to get like, a $10 billion investment in, the reparations department that does reparations through the entire state. But what if we can get that $10 million a year that goes to the local reparations commission and get that up to $25 million a year? So an institution that already exists, that's going to have staff, that's going to have the ability to move meaningful amounts of money, then you're going from $7 million a year to $25 million a year. So that's $70 million over 10 years to $250 million over 10 years. Like, this is the ability to have cumulative impact that at the scale, beginning to achieve the scale of repair that actually matches the scale of the suffering. And that's why we engage electoral politics, because if you have a 10, 15, 20-year horizon, like it's taken 6-7 years to get the Black caucus to the point where they're willing to stand up to the governor. But in that world, we have the ability to change the flows of funding to be able to get what would be, a $5 million a year allotment to something like $25 million a year, potentially. Something that really is concrete and pragmatic and can happen through like a reparations study and through a bill passed off that reparations study. Like, that's something that can concretely happen, that can begin to build the scale of repair and communal shifts where people begin to see the difference. Like, I was close like this. One of the people that we work with a lot in Baltimore is Captain Andrew. He's the captor of the local Fruit of Islam, but he also is part of the organization We Are Us. And he talked about, I was trained to do it myself. I was trained in a mentality that says, don't play the game of the grant game. But we worked for 10, 15 years. I was coming out of pocket, asking people in the community to help me do the work. And we kept failing. We kept failing over and over again. Violence in Baltimore kept getting worse. And then eventually he got a grant. And he saw the ability to scale up the work and said, okay, because I'm seeing something different happen. The scale of being able to engage community that's different. I got to figure out how to get this money. So in that spirit, I think we do have this mythology that if we could just do it ourselves, not have to play this game. But as I mentioned a couple of times before, I'm blanking on the name of the dude. You know the name of the guy, Jared. But they asked him why he robbed banks. He said that's where the money is. That's the same reason we do electoral politics, because they have stolen and misappropriated our tax money, our labor, our bodies for centuries. And the mechanisms that we have to repair are the market, philanthropy, and the government. And different people have different relationships to all those things. But I know with the government, we do have the ability to leverage our vote to be able to have meaningful impact on government money that we don't have on philanthropic or market money, right? So in that world, the billions of dollars that flow through the state, we have the ability to influence the flows of that capital to be able to put it into containers in our community that can actually do meaningful change for our community. And seeing someone like Captain Andrew say, I've seen what happens when we can scale up the work we do through infusions of capital. I can't leave that sort of revolutionary work up to philanthropy. We have to have the ability to use the credibility people like him have with the community to leverage public dollars and public support for investment. And we've seen that have incredible results on violence prevention. We also see that subject to federal budget cuts, and we see that subject to people in philanthropy and the police who see work like that as a threat. So we can't let work like that get lost because of the attacks that are happening to institutions like that. We have this tool of the government to secure and expand upon work like that. And I think it's our job as an institution to listen to voices like that, hear those people can work at scale, can change our community conditions at scale if they get the investment to work at scale. And I think that's what reparations is for me. And that's why we focus on reparations. And that's why we focus on electoral politics.
No, right on. Yeah, John Dillinger, I think, is the one that said the bank is where the money is. That's why I rob it. And then, but Bill Black wrote the book, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. So I just want to throw that in there as well. And he talks about the corporate theft of everybody's labor and wealth through banks. But yeah, right on. Renee, I
No,
was just interjecting that. Yeah.
As always. So I'm curious also. First, thank you for answering that question and for kind of looping it back to the current work that you're doing, because I think that gives like a tangible explanation for why you pursue the work that you do as LBS, which I think makes sense. And I also appreciate this. I appreciate your understanding of what is required for reparations, that it's not about just saying, no, don't get the check, but it is also about determining what actually fixes the things that need to be fixed based on the loss of institutions and finances that occurred throughout history based on these racist systemic practices that have always been a part of the nation's history, right? For me, you've crystallized something for me that we're gonna have to clip. And I'm still not, Ear Doctor's gonna kill me because I owe him a clip from Andy that I still haven't given him. But we're gonna need to clip this as well, because I think we're always having, well, I don't know, let me not say we too loosely, because apparently I'm the tether in the group right now on screen. So, right. But my, part of my frustration with these conversations with people about reparations is the minute I say to one of these crews of people, like, but it can't just be about individual checks only. There has to be a larger pursuit that is going to allow communities to survive and to get some sense of like liberation, self-determination, all of these things that cannot happen just by giving people a check. There has to be a larger scale pursuit of change, because if you get your check but nothing around you changes, I'm not really sure how that's beneficial. Has always been my my thought process. And I think for me, it's short-sighted of people to be like, well, that's just because you're a tether and you're a parasite and you want some of my money. And I'm like, you don't understand that we all live in the same, like, we're living under the same systemic constructs, right? So when the police officer pulls somebody over, it's not because they assume that they are a tether. It's because they look the way they look, and there is no way to identify any differential between me as what I'm now being called the anchor baby and Lawrence, who is apparently like full-blooded, like you probably qualify as one of these FBA ADOS things based on the story you just told, right, about your parents. And so like it just seems to be that to completely separate this idea that we're all impacted by the same systemic structures because we all live here in the belly of the beast, oppressed by the same systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying you shouldn't get a check. I'm saying that in addition to your check, you should be worrying about fixing the outside structures that are going to impact your life, whether you have that check or not. So I don't know. I don't know that there was really a question there, but
Yeah.
you came off mute, so I'm going to let you talk.
Yeah. I mean, it's something I wanted to mention because I was on a call yesterday. Like anything else in America, the overarching ideological conservatism and individualism impacts our mental conceptions of what liberation looks like. Perhaps no issue more so than reparations. Reparations in the Eurocentric legal construct is actually relatively conservative. It's about a discrete claim of property that I have, that someone has, my personal property, my individual property, that someone has violated. And I want recompense for my individual property rights being violated. And I think part of the issue with how some people interpret reparations is within that individual mindset. It can feel like it allows me to compete within American capitalism. Like, my problem is not with capitalism and the system of white supremacy and the political order or political economy. Is I've been deprived the ability to compete within the existing system. And it makes sense that certain people will be very loud on the internet, very vocal about their desire to have access to the pleasure and leisure that seems to be produced if you are at the top of this political economic order. And I think that part of the problem with the reparations movement is that people in reparations play fast and loose between some people, between this traditional, I believe, individualistic conservative frame of reparation and a radical collective critique of political economy of a radical view of reparations. So even many of our biggest reparations advocates, HR 40, is like based upon the template of Japanese internment reparations, which is about categorizing the harm, showing the harm, building the case for repair. But it's for Japanese internment reparations, in some cases, Jewish Holocaust reparations, it was quantifiable, documented individual property rights that we can show were violated, basically within the time period of people who are alive today. And that building a standing within existing American legal frameworks for individual recompense for that individual property claim being damaged. For American slavery, that does not make sense as a conceptual framework for how we're going to get reparations. It is a collective harm. We were the property. And many people did not have the ability to clearly articulate a paper trail back to individual slave owners, and those folks aren't alive anymore. So using a conservative, individualistic legal frame of property reparations for a communal, collectivist vision of reparations to a community and a group of people, they don't fit. But because we want to say the Jews got reparations, Japanese got reparations, I want reparations, many people don't make that argument because it actually makes it so that reparations, you have to have a different vision of what the advocacy is going to look like. And I think that many folks are stuck between the dream of reparations being their come up within the existing political order and wanting to sell reparations as a tool to fundamentally upset and destroy the existing political economic order. So like when Frank Wilderson says reparations are the end of the world, he's not talking about, I believe, getting a check to buy some Jordans or being able to go on vacation in Dubai. I think he's talking about, like, if we actually understood what the demand of recompense for the stealing of bodies would mean for the American political economic order, there is no ability to actually repay the amount of what is due for reparations. And it doesn't mean don't do it. It means have a conceptual framework of repair that, to me, I don't think it's necessarily exclusive of all checks and all recompense in terms, because there are individual families that got their land stolen. There are companies that were destroyed. There are people who were kicked out of the state, chased out of the state by lynch mobs. And if part of the Reparations Commission is to study that and do recompense for that, I think that's understandable and makes sense. But similarly, like, I just know in Maryland, a lot of us are Northern migration Blacks. We were not enslaved in Maryland. Our families were enslaved in my case, Louisiana, and I believe North Carolina. So looking at the lineage of Maryland slavery in itself would exclude most of the people in Maryland whose families came up during the Northern migration, right? So you actually even want to achieve some mechanism of redress, even in terms of cash payments, you're going to need a metric that actually fits a criteria that actually accomplishes the objective. So we've talked about using, can you document that your family went to a segregated school in Maryland? So then that would actually frame in lives of people who came up during the Nazi migration in the 40s and 50s and forced to go to segregated schools. But along those lines, simply a check for the longitudinal denial of life outcomes and economic opportunity that came from segregation ignores, as we know, through Derek Bell and people who study integration, part of the harm of what happened with schooling was integration destroying those Black schools and those Black teachers not getting those jobs. So for me, part of that recompense has to be, how do we build up Black schools and Black teachers, and thus being able to control the education and socialization of our youth in our community. So you couldn't have a check for the impacts of segregation without recognizing the need to restore the communal institution that was those segregated Black schools, but without the violence of the denial of funding. So to me, those two things can go hand in hand. But to take one without, especially taking the check without the repairing of the social institutional fabric, I think locks reparations in that individualistic, capitalistic, trying to compete within the existing economic order, while that larger frame extends it to a fundamental reshaping of the political economic order.
Thank you. We're gonna have to clip a lot of this. I don't know. As per usual, when Lawrence comes on, we're gonna have to clip a lot of this. So if you don't mind, Lawrence, because I just double checked the questions, and I think we've covered everything that was on the coming into list of what we wanted to talk about. But there's some interesting things happening in other places that I would love to get your take on, including the current situation that's happening in Texas. And I'm going to look up the young man's name so I don't get the name wrong. But for folks who are unaware, Carmelo Anthony, and I can't even tell you as a Syracuse graduate that the name Carmelo Anthony just hits different every time I hear it. So y'all have to pardon me, because the first time I heard this story, I was like, why is Carmelo Anthony?
I said the same thing.
Like, what is happening right now?
I said, why is an NBA Hall of Famer fighting white kids in stands of high school games? I was like, what is going on here?
Happened? Exactly. Yeah. So that aside, Carmelo Anthony, for people who are unfamiliar with the story, is a high school student who was in attendance at a track meet, if I remember correctly. There was an issue because of the rain. He was getting pushed out into the rain by Carmelo Anthony is Black. There was an issue with two white teenage students who are brothers. A fight ensued over what was happening. Carmelo pulled out a pocket knife, stabbed one of the brothers. That child eventually succumbed to the injuries and passed away. And Carmelo Anthony has now been indicted of murder charges. And the question that has come up is because there are stand your ground laws in Texas, whereas if you feel that your life is in danger or you are a threat and you do something in response to that threat and it results in the death of the other person, that you are protected under these stand your ground laws. So a lot of what I have been reading with regard to this case is really about the inequity of how stand your ground laws are applied between Black people and white people, whereas white people are allowed to use stand your ground laws to kill Black people, but Black people are not allowed to use those same laws in self-defense when a white person dies. And so it's a little off topic, but not so much, because there's also, there's this community harm, the violence. Why is this young man going to a track meet for his school with a knife in his pocket? Like, what is the background story for that? Why he felt that was necessary? So these are the things that have me thinking that I want your opinion, if you've been following this case.
When you mentioned it in Texas, once you said Texas, it clicked in for me. This is relevant because one of the things that we're dealing with here in Maryland is that Maryland is the state, I think, next to Alabama or Mississippi, that charges the most use as adults in the country. And we have some of the biggest racial disparities between white and black youth charged as adults. So there's a move, again, led by some folks in the Black Caucus to actually make it so that in Maryland, you were automatically charged as an adult for over 30 offenses, including amongst them are things like second-degree assault, which is basically just like, just like getting in a fight, simple gun possession, things like that. But the idea is that, these are young people that are animals. The only thing that can deter them is the threat of these extremely long sentences. But given the racial disparity, is locked into what we know about adultification of black youth, especially black boys. So part of the problem, of course, is when you have a then 17-year-old black youth stabbing a white youth. It's like, well, he couldn't have really been at threat because that 17-year-old was just a kid. But he's carrying a knife because he's really a bad guy in a young man's body. He's an adult really attacking this kid because of the perception of black people is not really embodying any possibility of innocence or childhood. One thing I've also found in this research is that there's a shockingly large amount of knife and gun carrying amongst young white people. So why is he carrying that knife? It's probably because white people around him are carrying guns and knives. And that gun and knife carrying amongst young white people is not actually prosecuted to the same extent it is amongst urban black youth. So just for his protection in that milieu, in an environment where there's a perceived risk of accused threats, then knife carrying actually makes sense, not because you're trying to rob somebody or try to attack somebody, just because you want some ability to inflict enough harm to be able to incapacitate someone who's coming at you. But the perceptions of the scripts we get of black youth is that if they're carrying a knife, what was they planning to do with it? They were clearly planning to do something bad with it, or else why would they be carrying it? So the idea of, again, especially adultified black youth as being vulnerable in any way, as being actually afraid for their life and safety, is so anathema to the mythology we get of the black brute, the young black drug dealer, the young black braggadocious thug who fears nothing, the super predator, right? So we have all these incongruous scripts about how we think about black youth, and even our community often leads to, what was he doing with it? Why was he having the knife? As opposed to seeing like there are white youth that have the perceived impunity of not being checked for knives and not being prosecuted when they have knives, but knowing they carry knives. As the data shows, wanting to have something to protect them in that environment is so incongruous with our perception of like white youth as innocent and black youth as inherent criminal, even in our community. And I think the last thing I would say is that the rapacious scripts from local media around promoting every single juvenile crime, they'll put a blacked out face on the screen. And subconsciously, many people project that as a black face, even when it's not a black person doing the crime. Because you'll see what look to me clearly like white people doing stuff, but because they're blacked out, you can project a black body onto it, even if it's a white boy, right? And just the rapacious scripts of people like Sinclair Media, realizing that threatening white people with the threat of wilding black youth, and the idea that black youth only get a slap on the wrist. They always get away, as George Zimmerman said about Trayvon Martin, right? This mythology that this hug-a-thug, soft-on-crime liberals have gone too far when it comes to juvenile justice protections means that the only way for us to deter these thugs is clear, harsh, disproportionately severe consequences for incidents like this, which are like most incidences, where it's like self-defense or someone gets in a fight and it gets out of hand, and tragically, in this case, somebody dies. The stuff like this is more the norm than it is the exception. And what we're seeing is a massive decrease in the incarceration for drugs and a massive increase in incidences like this where people get like 10, 20, 30 years for fights and stabbings and incidents that go left. So people think we've dealt with mass incarceration because people aren't getting locked up for dime bags of weed no more. But when you really got 10 people in jail for a year for a dime bag of weed versus one person in jail for 10 years for a fight, it's actually the same amount of people in prison. It's just instead of one person cycling in and out, you got one person in there for 10 years in terms of overall prison numbers. So actually, most of the declines in prison population have totally plateaued because of this massively disproportionate amount of time black people do for so-called violent crimes. And that actually means that our current rate, it would take until about 2080 for us to return to pre-1975 incarceration levels. And I think that's a lot of the white liberals wanting to focus on the innocent drug offender and not wanting to actually think about the reality of how violence happens in our society and take it seriously and study it, and take on the more politically difficult case of, we call these people violent offenders or repeat violent offenders. What's actually happening here? What are the conditions in community? What are the community institutions that would have to be rebuilt so people don't feel they need to carry knives? What are the type of places people can go where they can feel safe? And what are the type of things we need to do in order so when we do have an incident like this, there are institutions that folks, people can trust that they can send them to, as opposed to feeling they have to rely on the criminal legal system and lock somebody up because the only thing they think works, right?
And the stories coming out of this area with how the family's been treated and how the media has pounced on this story to highlight it specifically, for me, just of course that's what they do. And I just discovered in looking for an article to share with one of my groups about the background of the story, there is actually another case happening in Texas currently with a 17-year-old white child who stabbed to death what by name appears to be a Latino child during a fight at a school event. That child is not under this level of media scrutiny. They're not on $1 million bail. They're not, the family is not being attacked, and he is using stand your ground as his legal defense for what happened at this event. So I think for me, this dual path of literally the same exact thing happening, right? Like, and obviously, let me not say same exact thing, but like the general storyline of what happens. There's a fight, someone gets stabbed, the person who was stabbed dies from the injury, but the differential of one being a white 17-year-old who kills a non-white person and a black 17-year-old who kills a white person, and how those two cases are being treated completely differently. It says so much about exactly what you talked about with, how young black men are treated by media, how they're seen by the general public, this overarching idea of like this thuggery. And, like my first question really was like, why does he have a knife at it? Like, what is happening to him at school that he felt the need to bring a pocket knife with him to a track meet? And there was no concept in my mind of, this thug kid walking around with a knife. Like, if you're really not for nothing growing up in Brooklyn, like if you're really about thug life, you're not walking around with a pocket knife, just so we're all clear, right?
And you're not really going to school, and you're not really going to school track meets.
Right. And you're not going to track meets. Right. Like this is not your life, right? Like these things don't happen if you're really about that thug life. So, the fact that these questions aren't being asked for me is really problematic, but also, what I would expect, right?
Yeah. It's the first thing I think when I hear of a kid bringing a gun to school. It is, so easy to be like, why would you bring a gun to school? It's like, if you're in the place where you're carrying guns, why are you even going to school? Right? Because so many of those people are just dropping out on the corner. So there had to be something that they wanted to get out of the environment. And it probably wasn't to shoot somebody, right? It may have been to talk to somebody or to have some friendship, or maybe it was a teacher they liked or after school program they liked. There's something there that can be built upon. So it's overused at this point, but like an actual cultural strengths-based perspective that says there's something there that maybe they felt there was someone they would talk to. They were afraid and they needed someone like a counselor or a teacher they could talk to, or a friend. Because again, a lot of those people, if they're really deep in the streets, they've given up on school. So the fact that they would even go to school, I think to me is the starting point. Like, what drew them to school, right? And I think it's so easy for us to pathologize and demonize if we have no relationship or understanding to that activity. Because I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's just the environment that we're in. Baltimore being an independent city, So many people move into the county, so they feel like they don't have to think about this sort of stuff. But a lot of it follows them to the county, but then they act like they don't understand when someone brings a gun to school. And it's like, there are people doing that at Woodlawn High School. There are people probably doing that at Catonsville High School. And you aren't even thinking about it. But they just, every generation talks about it, but just like this separation between like actually understanding in context why people make decisions. And the last thing I want to say, I've said it a few times on different platforms, is we need to study our enemies. And Dr. Ball, maybe you can appreciate this. They're media savvy. They understand us sometimes better than we understand ourselves. Because one thing Sinclair Media deeply understands is that in the Black community, it is unacceptable for Black youth to violate elders through violence. And they understand that we as a Black community feel that the youth committing acts of violence is a 100% emergency. And what they do is they weaponize our love and desire to care for our youth into believing that the only way for us to reflect that love is through the criminal legal system. And they've become experts at that. And we have not become experts at deconstructing that and building alternatives to the criminal legal system, because they have a cultural understanding specifically of the anxiety that African people have around the intergenerational respect that needs to be shown to elders, and the intergenerational anxiety that comes with Black elders when they perceive that youth has gotten out of control. Now, we know is youth violence is down spectacularly in terms of its overall trajectory over the past 20 years. But that bump that happened right after the pandemic, Sinclair Media is riding it and running with it as if it is a 90s style youth crime wave that is absolutely out of control. And they take every single press release that comes from the police, and they literally do a news story that is nothing but turning that press release into a horror film for the Black Gen X, Black boomer mindset about the Black youth. And the conversation I had with Brother Alec Karakasanis, I just wish we'd focus more on that, as much on that as we focus on the New York Times. Because, the New York Times is going to get you interest and retweets amongst the liberal set, but it really is like the psychosis that's being embedded in sort of the Black over 40 crowd about their perception of Black youth that has almost no relationship to reality. But it gives people the ability to feel like they're fulfilling a communal role as protector of the youth by saying, we got to give them tough love. We got to get them locked up. Otherwise, the police going to kill them or they're going to die in the street. And that's just not the reality, the material reality of what Black youth are doing. But they have co-opted our desire to feel like we are protecting our youth into, not all, but some of our Black olders and elders really becoming their own independent propaganda tool for policeism. And we as a community have to not just take that seriously, but take that desire to feel like they're protecting you seriously, and gives them a way to redirect that desire into something pro-social, pro-communal, and anti-policeism. And I think that's part of why we focus so much on community-based violence prevention, because we see that as a tool to redirect that desire in a way that can fulfill that desire to protect community and youth, but not subject to police.
There's just a lot that we need to do. And I wonder sometimes, like you mentioned Alec Karakatsanis, and I wonder if, so I don't know that Alec would be the person that I would want breaking that media down, right? Not because he's not, like, I'm sure he's capable of doing it, but I wonder if one of the conversations we should be having with Alec is, how do we train people to do this, given his experience of so clearly outlining like how this works with the New York Times per se. Like, how do we translate that and use it as a tool for our own breaking of propaganda? Does that?
Yeah, it's going to look different for us than it's going to look for other people. I think a big part of it is like, if you don't come from a culture that has this specific cultural relationship to use, then it's going to be hard to understand what Sinclair is doing. Like, it's very clear to me what Sinclair is doing because I see the impacts of it. When, again, it's not the entirety of everybody over 40, but it's like local news radio. replicating this constant talking about youth carjacking. I think that's really because they've shifted away from murders because murders are down, but also most people feel like murders happen to people that are in the street game. Like my father will always say, Baltimore's the most violent city in the world for people who are drug dealers. But if you're like a human being, a so-called civilian, as The Wire says, you could get shot, but probably not. But you could get your car taken. And America's relationship with their cars is an extension and expression of their individual freedom. It is such a violation to a suburbanite to have their car stolen and to be carjacked, that they understand what it does within the psyche of the white person being carjacked, but they also understand with the black person that's like an added layer of violation of an older or an elder and anxieties about our youth being out of control. So like that fixation on it, despite the fact that carjackings are down, I think it's just like a really specific political strategy of an institution that is not a news organization anymore. It is a right-wing extension of the Republican Trump wing of the party's desire to use media as a tool to build political power for the right. Like, that's what Sinclair is at this point. And just having people understand who David Smith is, the way people understand, who other people in the media are, like all the juice that Larry Ellison got after he bought TikTok. Like, we got to have at least some of that juice and that focus and that attention for people like David Smith. And it's hard because if you're under 40 or really 50, a lot of people don't even watch local news. But just like the levels of a consistent voting base that may not be 50% of black folks, that may not even be 30% of black folks, but it's 15% of black folks who otherwise would be amenable to our position that are consistently voting in every election against our interest. The work is going to take for us to counter-organize or deprogram or redirect some of that energy, and giving people specific talking points to diffuse and deactivate some of the propaganda and propaganda that comes out of that channel. It's going to look different for us than it's going to look for someone like Alec, because it's going to need like a real specific, tangible connection to I'm seeing the impact of violence in my community very acutely. So as much as we need root cause foundational solutions to the problem of crimes, the redistribution of money and power, those may take 5, 10, 20 years to see results. I need stuff that I can feel and trust now. And again, I feel like that focus on grassroots community-based violence prevention has been our solution to that anxiety amongst people in our community around what can I see and engage and invest in right now that can address the fear and anxiety I have right now amongst black youth carjacking elders, people, specifically black elders. And I think that like the level of emergency I feel on that is just different than he does, because he sees the larger political economy and need to address all of it as his main focus of what's going to solve the problem. And for me, again, I feel like the level of emergency to focus specifically on the building of a case around investing in grassroots violence prevention is because I understand that specific political game Sinclair and the right wing is playing around fear mongering amongst youth carjacking, and how easily it's going to be for, again, to me, otherwise amenable voters. And I think that's part of the difference, is that we can often project a coherent ideological framework amongst someone who's being seduced by Sinclair propaganda as if they are right wing. In my experience, they are not right wing. These are Democrats. These are people that love Obama. These are people that oftentimes are anti-austerity. They may be pro-food stamps in some ways, right? Or at least when their food stamps get cut, or their cousin food stamps get cut, they got a problem with it, even though they may be like abstractly anti-welfare or something like that. But they're not ideologically right-wing. They might be pro-capitalist in some ways, like a lot of black people are, but they're people worth engaging and organizing that can be brought into some forms of engagement around political issues that we have some agreement with. And I think that's also a big part of the difference, is that in a abstract Marxist or traditional political analysis, those people are your enemy. And I think under an African-centered analysis, those are people that have been seduced by bits and pieces of injected oppression and propaganda, like many of us have been in different parts of our lives, and unfortunately, maybe again at some points, right? So being able to not even, if you don't engage them, you have to understand that some of these people have entire social networks of cousins, co-workers, church people, aunts, uncles that they influence. So in some ways, not even trying to deprogram them, but to give people talking points, because they have a multiplier effect amongst Black civil society. And if you take that Black civil society effect seriously, you need to inject alternative scripts within those nodes of Black civil society consensus making about how we think about crime and youth violence, to be able to have competition over the persuadables within Black civil society who are in the stew, and hearing bits and pieces of what we may be saying and bits and pieces about what they may be saying, and trying to process it and synthesize it. And I think it's just seeing the importance of those people as critical nodes of political power locally makes that work extremely important for me and my political project, where if you're at the 1,000-foot view about the billion-dollar political economy, trillion-dollar political economy, it's not going to be as important how to fight those hand-to-hand battles for political institutional legitimacy and conceptual hegemony around these issues, as someone maybe doing a different type of work might be.
I mean, there it is, y'all. I have so much respect for you, Lawrence, and I truly, truly appreciate your input. And every time you come back, I am further strengthened in my belief that you are one of the voices that we need to listen to regularly. And the new show that you're doing I'm loving it. So thank you for for adding that piece to my daily, my regular programming for the month. And you're so clear and concise. And as my mother says, whenever you come on, she's like, he's just brilliant. Like, there's kind of no wrapping around that. It just is what it is. And I truly appreciate you and your time and your willingness to always like have these discourses and to come in and to kind of struggle through getting people to understand where we are and where we need to go and how some of the paths that we need to follow in order to get there. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you all having me on. So yeah, happy holidays. And yeah, please check out all the work on Black Liberation Media. But again, we have 2 podcasts. One is In Search of Black Power. That's more national, international book reviews, like some of the larger conceptual stuff. But the new one that we're doing, Political Commentary Corner, is political commentary on local Maryland and Baltimore issues. So that's when we talk about the violence prevention work from a Baltimore perspective, but also bringing some academic analysis of the folks trying to make that work with police. So yeah, please like and subscribe to both of those podcasts, and also again, just all the other great work happening on Black Liberation Media. But if you are interested in some of the work we're doing politically, again, it's lbsbaltimore.com, LBS Baltimore on all social media sites, and especially if you sign up for our email messages, we're coming into legislative session here in Maryland. Again, 100-day session, all the laws passed at the state level, the governor, the state senate, the delegates. We're working on trying to prevent the automatic charging of youth as adults to deal with that disparity that happens when youth are put in the adult system that denied services. They're oftentimes basically put in solitary confinement because the thinking is keep them away from hardened adult prisoners, but it really creates this trauma that actually puts our young people on that path towards more negative outcomes. So that bill is coming down the pipe this session. It's going to be a big fight to get that over the finish line, because it is an election year in Maryland, and we're hearing that some of the lawmakers may want to just wait till next year, wait till after we get reelected, and then we'll do it, right? But we know our people can't wait, and we know that wait till next year can oftentimes be never, right? So we are also pushing the Reparations Commission work is coming out. So now that we have a commission, remember that veto delayed the commission's work by 6-7 months, but the deadline is still the same, 2027. So we actually have a crunch time frame to do the work of the commission. So we're obviously going to be trying to help support the commission and engage it. Obviously, we're also doing the local reparations for war on drugs work. So that's a Baltimore-based commission. There are also commissions in PG County, Montgomery County, at a local level, Baltimore County, that control their local pots of money to do the work of repairing the harm of the war on drugs locally. So please be sure to check us out on that. The last thing I would say is that, again, sign up for our emails, because that allows you to get emails about the things that are happening in Annapolis and who we need to contact to put pressure on to pass these bills. So that's so used to people working in anonymity that these emails really do matter. They really do create a sense that I'm being watched. Why are these people emailing me? Why are these people calling me? And the people say, like, LBS, what do you want? Because you got people calling and emailing me. So one of the things we're going to need that on is we're putting in a bill to, again, do the work of reparations, where there are institutions like Hopkins and other nonprofits that have these endowments, this pot of money that they have put into the market. And some place like Hopkins have these $1 billion endowments that the money is just making more money. So just a small tax on those endowments of those multi-billion-dollar institutions that are nominally nonprofits, but still make all of this money through investing in their endowments, would actually be an available source of revenue to actually do the work of reparations in the state of Maryland. So we're actually putting in a bill, knowing that's probably not going to pass this year, but starting the conversation about taxing endowments of places like Hopkins to actually be able to fund the work of reparations. And that's something that maybe we can talk about on a future conversation.
Right on. Please, everybody, check the links in the show description. Support the platform, like, share, subscribe, put this in your socials, Patreon, all the links again in the show description. Thank you, Lawrence, once again. Thank you, Renee, of course, and in advance for what I'm sure is a raucous and perfectly disciplined chat, the undefeated chat. Thank you all very much as well. Peace, everybody. Only through that fight that we know we need to have to get there, as Fred Hampton used to say, and we will see you next time with more
Saturday with Renee.